Welcome to video number 2. Let's talk about the beginnings of World War II here. First of all, let's talk about a couple of things that are going to add to this. And it looks like I got some sort of glare there. Um, First of all, militarism is on the rise. After 1900, after Bismarck, we see the rise of large armies. In most countries, militaries will double in size from 1890 to 1914. For instance, Russia will have 1.3 million soldiers. They won't actually have enough weapons for them, but they have it. France and Germany will have about 900,000 soldiers. British, Austria, and Italy will have between 250,000 and 500,000 soldiers. In Britain, they focus mainly on their navy. Many peasants are in the army. As armies grew, military leaders will gain influence and will begin drawing up these complicated plans for quick deployment that cannot be altered. Another thing that's going to really play a role in this is nationalism and ethnic groups within different countries that want their own independence. And socialism itself will play a part. This is the beginning of the period where you're going to begin to actually see the rise of Marxism. Excuse me 1 minute while I go close the blinds. I don't want to, I can't seem to pause the recording without having to start over. So hold on 1 moment, please. Sorry about that. And it didn't actually seem to help all that much. Maybe I can just. Well, nah. Well, there, that's a little bit better. Sorry about the delay. Um, so you got all of these different things, and this is the time where Marxism starts to really take hold. We're going to see it in the Bolshevik Revolution during this period. We're not going to talk about it a whole lot. Okay, so what's happening? Well, we know that there is a crisis in the Balkans. There is always a crisis of the Balkans. But what's going to start this war is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Actually, that's my sister's cat's name. And his wife on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo. It was done by a Serbian nationalist group known as the Black Hand. Gavrilo Princip is actually the name of the assassin. So here's what's happened here. We talked about in the last video that Austria had annexed parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo, and what they wanted to do was to show the flag, meaning that they wanted to show somebody in the royal family that, to show them who ruled them now, but they also knew that something could happen, so they picked someone who was relatively unimportant, and like Franz Ferdinand was way down the list in becoming king. So they sent him down there knowing that something could happen. Well, it does. It's one of those weird kind of things in history. Gabriel Princip is on the parade route. His first attempt to kill the Archduke doesn't go right. He gets another chance when the carriage carrying the Archduke and his wife get stuck in an alley, goes up and kills them both. Austria seizes the opportunity to blame the country of Serbia, even though they probably didn't have anything to do with it. So Austria wants to use this opportunity to take care of Serbia once and for all, but they were afraid of a Russian response, so they sought the reassurance and support of their major ally, Germany. William II does something here that history has called the blank check. Basically, what Germany says to Austria is, you do whatever you want to do. We have your back. Now, this has always kind of been a question of why did this happen? Well, for me, I think it kind of goes into what Wilhelm II wanted for Germany. He wanted to find Germany's rightful place in the sun, and that meant eventually fighting a war of conquest. Now, because of how Germany is situated in Europe, it could be cut off by like the British Navy or something else. So I always felt like Germany was a country that has to go to war at a time of its choosing. And I think in this particular case, William II thought this time was now. So Austria, though, wants to make it look like they're trying to be all diplomatic. We actually did the same thing before the Second Iraq War. And so they issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It's called the Serbian Ultimatum on July 23rd, 1914. If you're interested in it, Google it. It's an interesting document. These were extreme demands that were designed to force war. The idea was that Serbia would reject these notions out of hand. Austria would be like, see, we tried to be all nice. But the problem is, Serbia accepted all of the demands except for one because they would not give up their national sovereignty, but they agreed to a joint inquiry into events. So that's where we leave Austria. Austria is trying to make Serbia look unreasonable, and here they are accepting most of um, the ultimatum. Is that enough? Absolutely not. Austria declares war on Serbia on July 28th. At first, they tried to keep the war localized to Austria and Serbia. Obviously, that doesn't succeed. On July 28th, 1914, Nicholas II of Russia began to mobilize his army first against Austria. On July 29th, he called for full mobilization. Germany demanded that Russia had to stop mobilization within 12 hours or Germany would go to war with them. Nicholas II was like, yeah, that's the plan. We want to go to war. Let's do this. So Russia ignores that ultimatum. Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. Germany then prepared to use what was called the von Schlieffen Plan, VonSchlieffen, created by General Alfred von Schlieffen between 1891 to 1905. To say that this was the labor of his life is not an understatement. On his deathbed, he was making tweaks to it. So the plan was for a two-front war with France and Russia. A minimum force would be sent to fight the Russians in the east because they didn't think much of the Russians' uh, ability. They thought they could hold them off. The majority of the army would strike France quickly by going through neutral Belgium. The idea was after a quick defeat of the French army, they would then use their railroads to turn its attention to Russia. So Germany declares war on France on August 3rd. They demanded that Belgium allow their army to go through their country. Belgium was like, we'd rather you not. And Germany was like, we're not giving you a choice. Now, this is where the British come in. The British had an alliance with Belgium that promised to protect Belgian neutrality and sovereignty. And the British warned Germany that if they went through their invasion of Belgium, then Britain would not be happy and declare war. Now, Wilhelm II, who is a profoundly stupid man, I think, decided that the British would not go to war over a piece of paper. And so Germany begins its invasion going through Belgium. Britain declares war on August 4th. So let's look at the major countries who are at war here. Austria is at war. Germany's at war. They are at war with Serbia, Russia, and France. If you notice, one major power has not committed yet. That is Italy. Italy's going to kind of wait to see who offers them the best deal. So here it is. The war has begun, the Great World War. Many thought that war was so destructive now at this time, technology had brought it to a point where, ultimate war would destroy the world, and rational leaders would avoid it. Well, that didn't work out. So here's the deal. 1914, all nations are excited about going to war. Even in Russia, Nicholas II is more popular than he has ever been. All nations see this as an opportunity to go out there and show national pride, to show why their country was the absolute best. And basically, nationalism was run amok. Now, everyone believed that the war would last a matter of weeks, maybe months, because that is how wars in Europe had basically been fought over the last century or so. The idea was if you wanted a province or something, you would declare war, you would take that province, and then you would sue for peace, and it wouldn't take long. Well, the problem is, so everybody thought, boy, this would be exciting. It'd be like a vacation. We'll go do our thing, come back before Christmas. Um, but the problem is, they were looking at the wrong war. There was a war that had been fought about 50 years before this that would have told them everything they needed to know about what was going to happen. That was the American Civil War. The American Civil War was a complete and total war. What do I mean by that? It means it did not just affect the area in which the fighting took place, it affected all of the participants all over the world. Changes will have to be made to the way people live. So, with the belief that modern warfare would destroy all nations if it went on too long, many people thought, we'll go do this for a while, get it done quick. Well, 1914 to 1915 on the Western Front is often called the stalemate years. Now, here's what's going on in the West. German success was dependent on a quick defeat of the French. They believed that they would quickly go through Belgium and attack northern France, sweep around Paris, and surround the French army. Now, here's the problem. Now, you got the von Schlieffen plan, very good plan, probably. Problem number one, before they deploy it, the military leaders make some changes. They send more troops to the east, even though Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff said, don't do that, follow the plan. And everything is on a timetable, but at first, everything goes pretty well. By the first, so on August 4th, German troops moved into Belgium. By the first week of September, they reached the Marne River 20 miles outside of Paris. But the problem was they did not send enough troops to France. They were moving pretty quick, but they weren't on their timetable. And basically, the idea was if you weren't on the timetable of the von Schlieffen plan, you basically had to scrap it. So they were having success in France, but they were held back at the Marne. British troops mobilized and were in France quicker than expected. And there they fought the first Battle of the Marne, Marne. You'll have a lot of first and second and third battles. Not a lot of movement. British and French forces counterattacked under the command of General Joseph Joffre, not the guy from the Game of Thrones, and stopped the German attack from September 6th through the 10th. German troops fell back. The French did not pursue. German troops began to shore up their lines. They dug trenches. The French and the British did the same. If you were in a balloon over Europe at this time, you would have seen two lines of trenches that went from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. German and French lines would remain virtually unchanged for 4 years. In the east, there's a lot more mobile warfare. Russian forces moved into eastern Germany. The Germans destroyed the Russian army in two battles, the Battle of Tannenberg on August 30th and the Masurian Lakes on September 15th. Basically, the Germans had their best leader, Paul von Hindenburg, and his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, in the east. Austria, however, not very good fighters. They were defeated by the Russians in Galicia and were thrown out of Serbia. Italy will break their alliance and fight on the side of Britain, France, and Russia, and they attack Austria in May of 1915. France and Russia and Britain promised in a secret treaty, they promised Austrian territory to Italy, so they got their better deal. Well, what's going to happen in the east? The Germans will come to the aid of their Austrian allies. They will rout the Russian army, pushing them 300 miles back into their own territory. Now, the Russians don't mind fighting in their own territory. They got so much territory. They don't mind sucking an enemy in. That's what they did to Napoleon, but this was not going as planned. 2.5 million Russians will be killed, captured, or wounded. Russia was severely weakened. On September 15th, Germany, Austria, and Bulgaria eliminated Serbia from the war. So that should have been the end of the war, right? Serbia and Austria started. Serbia is out. Nope, war is going to continue. Now, I'm going to point this out about the Italian allies. I can say this because this was me. You know, when you're playing kickball on the playground and that last kid who was picked, because that was me, who was terrible at it, that's Italy at war. They aren't a whole lot of help, as we're going to see. So that's the first year of the war. It's a stalemate. It's dumbfounding to people who are military tacticians because war is based on mobility. They call it a race to the sea. You're trying to outflank your enemy. That is my extent of knowledge of military tactics right there. I hope you enjoyed it. So, what's going on here? Well, in 1916 to 17, success in the East allowed Germany to move some troops back to the West, but they are going to be in trench warfare. Trenches become an elaborate system of defense with barbed wire 3 to 5 feet tall, 30 feet wide, concrete base for machine guns, and a heavy artillery further back. Basically, you lived in a hole. The area in between trenches was known as no man's land. The trench warfare was, as I said, very dumbfounding. And because of how slow this was, the publics in different countries began to demand action. And so, what would happen is each country would attempt to break through the lines by sending large numbers of men at the opposing side. Occasionally, each side would call for an offensive. It began with an artillery barrage to take out the barbed wire. Soldiers would then climb out of their trenches with bayonets, began to move toward the opposing trench. Most offenses were a terrible failure, mainly because the artillery is too far back to take out the machine guns. So basically, what happens is you're climbing out of your trench, you got your bayonet ready, you're going to shoot some people, you're going to stab some people. Problem is, you get out into no man's land, their machine guns are still intact, and they mow you down. So most offenses are a failure. Some examples, millions will be killed during attempted breakouts. Examples being the German offensive at Verdun, the British attack on the Somme, and the French attack on the Champagne. Verdun is kind of an interesting case because that's where the French army is broken. That's where France really starts to have their military issues. In fact, trench warfare will be seen as futile. In 10 months of fighting at Verdun, 700,000 will be killed over a couple of square miles, and Verdun really even wasn't worth it. What's trench life like? Well, poison gas was introduced in 1915, so that's fun. You had to deal with the smell of decomposing soldiers. The British had a macabre song called that one of the lines was, if you wanted to see your old friends, just go to the barbed wire because there's probably still pieces of them in there. Soldiers would rotate through the trench system. We're going to do it differently when we get there, but what they did was 1 week in the front line in combat, 1 week in the reserve trench, and then 2 weeks behind the line. If you were really fortunate, there was some sort of town back there where you can have some fun. What eventually happens, and the first people to realize how stupid trench warfare is, are the people in the trenches. And so what happens is you have the beginnings of a live and let live system. Led to agreements between both sides, like the Christmas truce, things like that. They agreed that they would not destroy latrines or attack during breakfast or tea time, things like that. On lesser raids, they would give warnings so that you could get up, get your rifle, that kind of thing. But it was ultimately stupid. Now, why is it a world war? Well, obviously the United States will get involved. We're not there yet. Well, first of all, the Ottoman Empire enters the war on Germany's side in 1914, so that opens up the Middle East. The Brits actually will attempt to open a Balkan front, landing at Gallipoli near Constantinople in April 1915. It is a huge failure. It almost destroys the political career of a guy named Winston Churchill. Bulgaria entered on the side of the Germans. Um, Italy, as I mentioned, was a terrible ally. In the Middle East, Lawrence of Arabia, you may have heard of that god awful long movie, was a British officer who went around the Middle East to get Arab princes to rebel against the Ottoman Empire in 1917. In 1918, British forces from Egypt destroyed what remained of the Ottoman Empire in that region. British forces will, in fact, come from India, Australia, and New Zealand. The Allies, British in particular, will seize German colonies in Africa and Asia. Actually, Japan will take a lot of their Chinese possessions. The French will use African soldiers in Europe. The French drafted 170,000 West African soldiers, who some fought in the trenches. 80,000 African troops were killed or injured in Europe. They'll also be used as laborers. 100,000 African laborers will die. Now, why do I mention that? Because when we are in the war, we have a segregated army, but we send black soldiers over to Europe. And in France, they noticed that African soldiers were treated very well. In fact, African Americans were also treated very well in France. In fact, some American military leaders did not like it. They kind of said, could you please stop treating them like, human beings? Because, they kind of don't get that at home. So that's why I kind of mentioned that. Japan joined the Allies on August 23rd, 1914, took control of German territories in China, and with New Zealand and Australia, conquered New Guinea from the Germans. Now, before I start talking about the United States, I do want to talk about new technologies in the war, and then we'll start talking about our country. So, at the end of 1915, planes will make their first appearance. At first, planes were used to spot enemy positions, and then they attacked ground targets, including communications. Finally, planes fought each other. Now, basically, what happened then is they fought with pistols. Um, Basically, they just kind of, just leaned out the cockpit with the gun and shot each other. Then eventually, they have machine guns. You've heard of the Red Baron, Snoopy's greatest enemy. If you haven't heard that song, look it up, Snoopy and the Red Baron. Um, Planes were also at first began to be used to target, attack ground targets, including communications. Now, we think of a plane dropping missiles or bombs. The first thing that planes actually used at this time is they basically dropped bricks. So they had bricks in the cockpit and they just drop it on different positions. Um, Germans also used airships called Leopards to bomb London. Great psychological benefit until people realized how explosive they were. We're also going to see the beginnings of tanks introduced in Europe in 1916. The first was a British model with a caterpillar track, easier to move across terrain, armed with a mounted gun, basically a Jeep on caterpillar tracks. 1918 is the British Mark V, more powerful engine, more maneuverable, effective at pushing the German army back, but did not have a whole big effect on World War One. So, where I want to talk about now is what's going on with the United States. All right, so as we know, Woodrow Wilson is president. He decides on a strict course of neutrality. He said we must be neutral in thought, word, and deed. Now, why did he do this? Well, because frankly, in World War One, there was no real guarantee which side we would end up being on. We had that kinship with Great Britain, obviously, and France from our history. Our relationship with Great Britain had gotten better, but after 1848, we had a lot of German immigrants. We have a lot of Irish immigrants who don't like the British, so neutrality seemed like the best idea. You did have many who supported the British and the French, but Wilson also believed that all the parties in the war were responsible and the United States really should stay out of it. Now, Americans, however, do have strong opinions about the war because we're Americans, informed or not, we have strong opinions. So we do have some questions. How does this affect our trade? Who do we trade with? Do we trade with both sides, one side, or none? Wilson at first banned bank loans to the fighting countries. He thought that if we took away our money from them, then they would stop fighting. Jefferson tried something similar, it didn't work. The ban is lifted in 1915 because the lack of economic activity almost caused a recession. Now, technically, American banks could loan to both sides, but most money went to the British and their allies. We were loaning the British an average of $10 million a day, where loans to Germany dropped to 1% of what they had been before the war. Now, part of this was it was hard to trade with Germany because of the British blockade. And we did begin to see stories about German atrocities in Belgium, yellow journalism. Some were true, some weren't. The support of Britain upset many German and Irish immigrants, but eventually it's war in the ocean that begins to affect America. Blockade hurt our trade. American ships to Germany were stopped and seized for contraband, which was legal. The problem was in 1915, the British added food and medicine to the list of contraband, which was a violation of international law. In March of 1915, Wilson protested British blockade policies, and the British said, okay, here's the deal, America. We don't want you sending medicine and food to the Germans. What if we bought more cotton from you? Would you like us to buy stuff from you? And we're like, we're cool, Britain. That's awesome. Please buy our stuff. Consider our problem with you solved. So, Wilson was also upset about German U-boats in the Northern Atlantic. The Germans are using these submarines, these U-boats, to great effect. This is before sonar, so they could kind of sneak up on people and blow them up. And the thing here was, the reason it works so well is that you could sneak up on somebody and you could blow them apart. Now, according to international law in international waters, they're supposed to give warning before they fired on a ship. Now, if they came up, gave warning, attention, attention, we're going to shoot at you. If it was a British destroyer, the U-boat would be destroyed. So they were very dependent on the element of surprise. On May 7th, 1915, a U-boat sank the Lusitania, which had Americans on board. Now, technically, it ended up being an actual legitimate target because there were guns in the hold. Wilson demanded war reparations and to accept Americans' rights to travel the seas. Now, the thing is, the Germans were like, we warned you. If you go back to Newsbank, I was going to say Microfiche, but we don't use that anymore. If you look at old newspapers from port cities during this time, the German government actually paid for ads, and it said, we consider the entire northern Atlantic area a war zone, and we will fire on any ship we see there. So they feel like they gave us a warning. Now, eventually, this does lead to conflict with Germany, but because Wilson wanted all neutral nations to have the ability to travel freely. William Jennings Bryan, a guy we're going to talk about more, we talked about him some, actually wanted to ban U.S. travel to the war zone. This was refused. He resigns. In August of 1915, the Germans sank a ship called the Arabic, killing 2 Americans. On September 1st, 1915, the Germans issued the Arabic Pledge that said they would no longer sink passenger lines without warning. And they renounced attacks on merchant ships at that time. This avoided war for now. Now, in the United States, some groups did begin to call for military trainings for all men of different ages. Progressives did not like that idea. Wilson runs for re-election on the slogan in 1916 of "He kept us out of war." He didn't want to use that slogan because he knew war was coming. He also campaigned on the idea of readiness. He won the Electoral College 277 to 254. Now, what is going to cause us to get into this war? Now, normally the Lusitania is blamed. It's not really the cause. What really causes it is that from 1914 to 1917, the Germans spent $12 million to support the rebels in Mexico. In 1916, there was a Mexican rebel named Francisco Pancho Villa. He had some taco places named after him later, who began to attack American border towns. This was done to hurt the U.S. supported government in Mexico. Wilson actually sends 12,000 troops under John J. Blackjack Pershing to arrest Pancho Villa. They class at a place called Carrizal, June 21st, 1916. Wilson was prepared to call for war until he found out, much like Han Solo, America had fired first. And so negotiations began. Troops left in January of 1917, and so we began to turn our attention back to Europe. Wilson will propose a peace settlement on January 22nd, 1970, called Peace Without Victory, based on American principles. Eventually, you'll get the 14 points out of this. I want you to take a look at the 14 points. What he wanted to do, Wilson wanted to export democracy overseas and to expand our imperial reach. This honestly had very little effect as Germany decides to go back to unrestricted warfare. This is what will get us into the war. Now, here's what happens. Now, I told you that Wilhelm II, didn't always necessarily make the best decisions. Well, he was convinced, his military advisors came to him and said, we got to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare. If we do that, we can starve the British out in 6 months. Now, William II was like, that sounds awesome, but I kind of promised the United States I wouldn't do that anymore. What if they get mad? Well, his admiral, a man named Hohenzollern, excuse me, no, that's not right. His name is Hosendorf. Hohenzollern's the Prussian family. I apologize. Admiral Hosendorf said, I give your majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent. And William II's like, cool, that sounds good. Let's do that. And that's what's going to begin our march into the war. So we began deliberating about war on February 1917. In mid-February, we learned about the Zimmermann telegram or telegraph. This was a diplomatic cable sent from Germany to Mexico. The British found it and deciphered it for us. That was really nice of them. And in this telegram, Germany offered Mexico help in retaking Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they would start a border war to keep us out of the European fighting. They also asked Mexico to mediate disputes between Japan and Germany, so the idea was they would elevate Mexico on the international stage. They also wanted to get Japan to attack U.S. positions in the Pacific Ocean. The president of Mexico, who did not want to fight the United States, after all, the last time Mexico and the United States fought a war, we took 55% of their country. So that went nowhere, but we get this telegram. The State Department makes it public on March 1st. Anti-war people said it was a forgery. Wilson cut off diplomatic ties with Germany. Germany, by this point, began sinking 500,000 tons of Allied shipping each month. Finally, on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked for a declaration of war. And he begins to lay out his reasons for fighting. It's not about territory or trade. It's about all these wonderful idealistic ideas. When you read the 14 points and we talk about the Treaty of Versailles, you'll understand that. The vote was 90-6 in the Senate for war and 373-50 in the House. Senator George Norris called this a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. That's basically war right there. One interesting note: the first woman to be elected to Congress, Jeannette Rankin of Utah, voted against the war. She then lost her seat partly for that reason. She was reelected in 1940, where she also voted against war against Japan and then lost her seat again. But at least she had, standards. Most Americans rallied behind the war effort once it was declared. Um, this was very good for the Allies because the Tsarist regime in Russia had collapsed. I'm not going to really go into the rise of Lenin. If I can find you a nice short kind of video about the Russian Revolution, I'll post that for you. Anyway, Lenin comes to power. At first, there's actually two revolutions: the March Revolution and the October Revolution. There was a provisional government. The problem with the provisional government is they tried to keep fighting the war. That just didn't work out very well for them. So Lenin comes in, the communists take over. Lenin negotiates the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, putting Russia officially out the war. This is a very harsh treaty. Russia gives up a lot of territory. The guy who actually, Leon Trotsky, said to the German, we don't intend to live up to this, right? And the German says, that's okay, neither do we. But the important thing was this basically put Russia out of the war, so American involvement becomes very important. Now, the problem is, how quickly can we get this done? And we weren't really known very well for getting things done quickly. So, before we get to the last of the war, I want to begin talking about the home front. Now, we're about 37 minutes at this video, so let me stop this video here, and then we'll pick up with the home front and the conclusion of the war in our next video.